There's a building sitting in the Uplands area of Swansea, South Wales, that has quietly watched over a century and a half of British history. It was built in 1859, before the telephone existed, before the motor car, before two world wars rewrote the map of the world entirely. It stood through all of it. Victorian families lived inside its walls. A doctor ran his practice from its rooms. The Catholic Church eventually took ownership and used it as a bishop's residence, and then, for more than 5 years, nobody lived there at all. The windows stayed dark. The floorboards settled. The building just sat there, sealed up, silent, holding on to everything it had ever collected inside its walls. Then, in the spring of 2024, two people picked up the keys. What followed wasn't just a renovation story. It became one of the most unexpected journeys to come out of British social media in years, and it all started with a decision that most people their age would never have gone near. Millie was 26. Louis was 27. They were a couple from South Wales, and by almost every sensible measure, they had no business taking on a 7-bedroom Victorian mansion in the condition it was in. The property had been sitting empty for over 5 years before they arrived. 5 years of no maintenance, no heating cycles keeping the structure stable, no one walking the corridors or checking the roof after a hard winter. Anyone who has ever dealt with an older property knows what that kind of neglect does. Things compound, walls crack, moisture finds a way in. The longer a building that size sits abandoned, the longer the repair list gets. The house was on the market for $450,000. It had been in the hands of the Catholic Church, and that's exactly who they purchased it from. The listing described a period staircase, 4 reception rooms, a ground floor with an entrance foyer and rear hall, 5 bedrooms on the first floor, 2 more on the second floor, a cellar underneath, and an old stable at the back. It still had its original coving, marble fireplaces, and double-height ceilings. The bones were extraordinary. The state it was in was a different conversation entirely. They called the purchase a huge risk, not looking back on it years later with the benefit of hindsight. At the time, in the moment, they described it as a huge risk and committed to it anyway. Louis had some renovation experience behind him, but Millie was upfront from day one about the fact that she was learning everything as she went. No trade background, no project management history, no years of building sites to draw from. Just two people who had decided that this building deserved to be saved and that they were the ones who were going to do it. To keep costs manageable, they planned to do as much of the work themselves as physically possible. On a project at this scale in a building this age, that's not a lifestyle statement, it's a financial strategy. Every job they could learn to do themselves was money that didn't have to go to a contractor. It also meant the work would move at the pace two people without trade backgrounds could actually sustain, which is slower than most renovation programs would have you believe is normal. They picked up the keys in March 2024, and within weeks the building started showing them what had been hiding inside it for decades. When you strip back a Victorian house that has been standing for 165 years, you're not just doing building work, you're peeling back time. Every family that ever lived inside those walls left something behind. Sometimes deliberately, sometimes carelessly, sometimes because the building simply swallowed things whole and never returned them. Millie and Louis started with the essentials, lifting floorboards to assess the subfloor, opening up doorways that had been bricked over at some point in the property's long history, pulling back brickwork that had been laid over the original architecture, probably by a previous owner who had their own reasons for sealing things off. Loud, dusty, unglamorous work, the kind that has to happen before anything visible can change. While unblocking one of those sealed-up doorways, they found something in the cavity behind the brickwork. Buried there, packed in alongside whatever else had been placed when the passage was sealed, was a Second World War helmet insert. Not a display piece, not something placed deliberately for someone to find. An actual piece of wartime military equipment, sitting inside a wall that had been bricked shut, waiting. They looked at the name written on the inside, Dr. Cornelius Patrick Robinson. An Instagram follower who came across the discovery later traced him. He had served in the Royal Army Medical Corps, and he had lived in Belgrave Villa between 1949 and 1986, nearly 4 decades inside that building. He had been a doctor, which explained why the property had at one point served as a surgery. His helmet insert had been sitting in that sealed wall cavity for an unknown number of years, completely undiscovered, until the brickwork finally came down. That was only the beginning of what the building had been holding. In a drawer somewhere in the house, they found a certificate of authenticity for a piece of the Cross of Christ, a document claiming to verify the provenance of a fragment of the most significant relic in Christian history just sitting in a drawer. The fragment itself was nowhere to be found. Millie addressed it the only way you reasonably can. They found the certificate, but there was no cross. Whether whoever last owned that document took the relic with them, or whether it's still somewhere inside those walls in a place nobody has thought to look yet, nobody knows. Their plumber, working on the upper floors, found something else. While pulling back the floorboards on the top floor, he came across a Christmas card from 1921. Over 100 years old, tucked between the boards, perfectly preserved. In the same wall cavity that had contained the helmet insert, they found Victorian-era polish from the 1800s, still in its original container. And while working in the master bedroom lifting more floorboards, they came across a newspaper article from 1925, a piece covering the death of Queen Alexandra of Denmark, who had served as queen consort to the United Kingdom at the turn of the century. Every single one of these objects had been sitting undisturbed through the reigns of multiple monarchs, through 2 world wars, through every family and occupant who had passed through that building over more than a century. The walls had kept all of it, quietly, without anyone knowing. And now 2 people in their mid-20s were uncovering it all, one room at a time. They were also filming everything. On the 14th of April, 2024, Millie and Louis posted a video to Instagram. It wasn't produced or scripted. It showed what they had found in the first stage of the renovation: the hidden doorways, the beams that had been covered over, the character features buried beneath decades of additions, the kind of footage that shows you a building underneath a building. That video was viewed more than 30 million times. 30 million views. On a personal account belonging to 2 people who 6 weeks earlier had just picked up the keys to a derelict house. It happened in days. The renovation content space on social media is massive and fiercely competitive. There are hundreds of channels documenting builds and restorations and period property projects, and yet something about what Millie and Louis were doing cut straight through in a way that most creators in that space never manage. Part of it was the building. A 165-year-old former bishop's residence purchased from the Catholic Church, full of sealed rooms and hidden passages and objects from another century, is not a standard renovation project. People understood that immediately and couldn't look away. But the bigger part of it was the honesty. They weren't presenting a polished version of the journey with the messy bits edited out. They were showing exactly what it looks like when 2 young people take on something enormous with limited experience and limited resources and refuse to quit. That's a story people recognize, not because most people have ever bought a Victorian mansion from a church, but because most people understand what it feels like to have committed to something bigger than they were certain they could handle. And the combination of a building full of genuine mysteries and 2 people who weren't pretending to have all the answers turned out to be something millions of viewers couldn't get enough of. The response was overwhelming. That was Millie's own word for it. People came into the comments with historical knowledge, with archive research, with renovation advice, with family stories about similar buildings. Someone took the time to properly trace Dr. Cornelius Robinson's military service and brought that history directly to the couple's attention. The community that formed around the channel wasn't just watching, it was participating. They committed to posting a new YouTube video every single Wednesday, not when they had something particularly exciting to share, not on a loose whenever it feels right schedule. Every Wednesday without exception. That discipline is what separates channels that spike and fade from channels that build something real and lasting. The audience that arrived after the 30 million view moment needed somewhere to go, something to come back to. Millie and Louis made sure it was there. The numbers kept growing. Every platform climbed. Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, Facebook. The audience followed them across all of it and brought more people along with them. But a building that size doesn't stop having problems just because the internet decides it's fascinating. Here's the part that tends to get buried under the discovery footage and the follower counts. The part that doesn't make for clean, satisfying thumbnails, but that Millie and Louis never tried to hide. Belgrave Villa was not in good structural condition when they bought it, and fixing that was always going to come before anything else. In a video from mid-2024, Millie posted with the caption, "Minor setback, house is falling down." Those words. Not an exaggeration for effect, not creative license. An honest, on-camera acknowledgement that the building was presenting them with real structural failures that had to be dealt with before anything else could move forward. When you're working on a Victorian property that sat abandoned for 5 years, that kind of discovery isn't a surprise. It's practically a given, but knowing it's coming and living through it are 2 different things entirely. By September 2024, They had worked through 2 of the 3 major structural jobs the building required. That's an enormous volume of work before you've even started thinking about rooms and finishes. Structural repairs on a Victorian property at this scale take time, take money, and frequently reveal new problems the moment you get into them. You open up one wall to fix one thing, and you find 2 more things behind it that have been waiting for someone to notice. Every discovery sets the clock back, and the clock costs money. There was also an incident that became its own dedicated YouTube episode. In October 2024, they referenced a situation where someone had accessed the property. An intruder had been inside the building. The full account was given in a Q&A video on the YouTube channel, and the fact that their audience was engaged enough to want the full story told says everything about how closely people were following the project by that point. The building was famous, and with fame comes a different kind of exposure. The financial pressure running through all of it was never far from the surface. From the very beginning, the decision to do as much of the work themselves as possible was driven by the reality of what this project actually cost. When you're tackling full structural repairs, new plumbing, new electrics, floorboards, ceilings, and a room-by-room fit-out across 7 bedrooms plus every common area in a period property, the budget is always working against you. There's no version of this project where the money stops being a concern. The only question is how fast it moves and how much you can absorb by learning the trades yourself. Millie and Louis kept going. Week after week, the content came out, the work continued. And on the other side of all of that pressure, something significant started to emerge. By early 2026, 2 years into the project, the progress inside the building had become undeniable. The kitchen, the room that arguably defines whether a house actually functions as a home, had been completely transformed. Working with bespoke kitchen company Olive & Bar, they had created something that matched the scale and the character of the original building. Burgundy cabinetry, quartz countertops, a room that Millie described as the nicest she had ever seen the place look. And she said that while acknowledging how long that room had been out of action, sitting unusable, waiting for someone to bring it back to life. Then came the announcement that confirmed just how far this journey had carried them. In February 2026, Kitchens, Bedrooms and Bathrooms magazine, one of the leading renovation publications in the UK, announced that the Belgrave Villa kitchen would be the cover of their April issue. Millie made the announcement on YouTube. Her exact words were, "This is absolutely crazy, but our kitchen is going to be on the cover of a magazine." The same person who, 2 years earlier, had openly described herself as learning everything from scratch while surrounded by a building that was actively falling apart around her, was now looking at her own completed work on the cover of a national publication. That arc matters. That's not a small thing to sit with. The shoot came together properly. Professional photographers, a stylist from the magazine, a large pot plant brought in specifically to emphasize the height of the ceilings, wildflowers chosen because the stylist felt they suited Millie's taste, and Millie confirming they'd got it exactly right. The finished cover went out to KBB's full readership when the April issue landed in March 2026. A building that had been abandoned for 5 years before they arrived was being featured in a national magazine. The people who took a chance on it had 2 million followers watching them work. It's worth pausing on that number for a moment because 2 million Instagram followers doesn't happen by accident or just because a building is interesting. The renovation content space on YouTube and social media is enormous. It is not short of channels documenting period property restorations, budget builds, and ambitious DIY projects. Most of those channels are competent. Some of them are well-produced. Almost none of them break 30 million views on a single video within weeks of starting. And even fewer convert that viral spike into a 2 million strong audience that sustains and grows for 2 years. What Millie and Louis did that was different wasn't about production quality or clever editing strategies. It was about stakes and honesty presented at the same time. The stakes were real money, real structural risk, a real building that could genuinely defeat them if it wanted to. And the honesty was consistent. They showed the falling walls and the intruder situation and the structural jobs alongside the beautiful artifacts and the finished rooms. Audiences can tell the difference between a constructed narrative and a real one, and they respond to real ones in a way that no amount of production budget can manufacture. The channel's growth rate in early 2026 was running at over 40% month-on-month. For a channel already past 430,000 YouTube subscribers, that's a genuinely unusual trajectory. Most channels at that scale have started to flatten out. This one was still accelerating, and across all platforms combined, the estimated annual income being tracked by analytics services was sitting somewhere between $167,000 and $228,000, which only accounts for what can be calculated from publicly available data. The practical reality of those numbers is that the renovation, which started as a financial gamble, has become the thing funding itself. The building is generating the income that's going back into the building. That's the outcome of 2 years of commitment, and it's an outcome that most people who start a renovation channel never reach. As of April 2026, they're still at it. The channel is still posting every Wednesday. Recent updates show the living room work in progress, bathroom renovations starting to take shape, new rooms being opened up and addressed one by one. For a 7-bedroom Victorian property with a cellar, a stable, and more surface area than most people will ever work on in their lives, there are still a lot of rooms left. That's not a criticism, it's the reality of the project, and Millie and Louis have never tried to pretend otherwise. They didn't buy a house that was close to finished. They bought a building that nobody else wanted to touch, and they are working through it systematically, room by room, week by week, showing every part of it to the people who want to watch. There's something worth saying about that consistency. 2 years is a long time to maintain a creative output on a weekly schedule, while simultaneously doing physically demanding renovation work, managing the financial pressure of a project this scale, and building an audience that now expects content to arrive reliably. A lot of creators burn out at a fraction of that workload. Millie and Louis are still going, and from every visible signal, they're not slowing down. Belgrave Villa was built in 1859. It has outlasted every person who ever lived inside it. It watched Dr. Robinson come home from his service in the Royal Army Medical Corps and raise a life within its walls for nearly 4 decades. It held onto his helmet in a sealed cavity and said nothing for years. It kept a Christmas card folded under its floorboards for over a century without anyone knowing. It housed bishops and surgeries and families through 165 years of British history, then sat in silence for 5 years while everyone passed it by. 2 people in their mid-20s decided it wasn't finished yet. What they've built since picking up those keys in March 2024 isn't just a renovation project. It's a record of a building that deserved better, of the work it takes to give something old a future, and of what happens when 2 people commit to something far bigger than themselves and refuse to walk away from it when it gets difficult. Because it did get difficult. The walls came apart in ways they didn't expect. The budget never stopped being a real concern. The building kept throwing problems at them long after the 30 million views had arrived and the magazine covers had been confirmed. None of that changed their answer. The Victorian craftsmen who laid those floorboards in the 1860s couldn't have known that a Christmas card hidden between them would one day be watched by millions of people on a platform they couldn't have conceived of. They couldn't have known that the building they were constructing would become the subject of a channel followed by 2 million people a century and a half later. They just built something to last. It did last, and now somebody is finally making it worth the wait.